A millionaire humiliated his housekeeper before sending her away. The next day, he was stunned to learn she held the deed to the land his mansion stood on. The ballroom of the Hawthorne mansion was alive with opulence. Guests floated through the space like figures in a dream, dressed in silks and satins that caught the glow of the massive crystal chandelier above. The floors, a polished white marble that stretched from wall to wall, reflected the golden light, amplifying the decadence of the evening. Every corner of the room was curated to impress, from the towering floral arrangements to the orchestra playing softly in the background. Yet none of it commanded as much attention as Daniel Hawthorne himself. Daniel stood near the grand fireplace, a glass of single malt scotch in hand, his tailored tuxedo cutting a sharp silhouette. His dark hair was slicked back, not a strand out of place, and his green eyes glimmered with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. As he spoke, his voice was smooth, every word calculated to draw admiration from the circle of guests gathered around him. "And that's when I told the board," he said with a smirk, "if they couldn't see the potential in a billion-dollar merger, perhaps they weren't the visionaries I thought they were." Laughter rippled through the group. His charm was magnetic, his wit sharp. Daniel thrived on this. The attention, the power, the validation. It was his world, and everyone else simply lived in it. From the edge of the room, Evelyn watched quietly. The housekeeper's uniform she wore was plain but perfectly pressed, her dark hair neatly tied back in a low bun. She moved efficiently, ensuring the guests' glasses were always full, their needs attended to without so much as a word. She had worked in the mansion for years, yet nights like this still left her feeling invisible, a shadow against the gleam of wealth. "Evelyn," Daniel's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Heads turned as he beckoned her forward with a flick of his wrist. She approached calmly, her face a mask of professionalism, though her hands tightened around the tray she carried. "Yes, Mr. Hawthorne? Did you happen to notice the state of the hors d'oeuvres?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "They're barely appetizing. If this is your idea of quality, we'll need to have a serious conversation about standards." Evelyn blinked, her posture unwavering. "I'll speak with the caterers immediately, sir." "See that you do," he snapped, loud enough for those nearby to hear. A smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth as he added, "And do try not to embarrass yourself any further tonight. This is a high-class event, after all." There was a ripple of laughter from the guests around him. Evelyn nodded once, her expression impassive, and turned to leave. But as she walked away, a faint blush crept up her neck, a silent betrayal of the humiliation she felt. In the kitchen, the staff worked in a flurry of activity. Evelyn entered briskly, placing her tray on the counter. One of the younger maids looked up, her brow furrowed. "What did he say this time?" she asked hesitantly. "Nothing that hasn't been said before," Evelyn replied, her voice even but tinged with an undercurrent of frustration. She adjusted her sleeves and turned her attention to the task at hand. The room was tense, the staff exchanging knowing looks but saying nothing. Evelyn's composure was unshakable, yet they all knew how much it cost her. Back in the ballroom, Daniel continued to bask in the glow of admiration. He hardly gave Evelyn another thought, too absorbed in his own performance. Yet, despite his apparent oblivion, there was a subtle shift in the room's energy. A few guests whispered quietly, their eyes flickering toward Evelyn whenever she passed by. "She's been here for years, hasn't she?" one woman murmured, a thin flute of champagne balanced delicately in her hand. "Longer than that, I think," her companion replied. "There's something odd about her, always so composed. It's unnerving." As the night progressed, Evelyn found herself on the terrace, taking a moment to breathe. The cool night air was a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom. She stared out over the sprawling estate, the gardens bathed in moonlight, the vast expanse of land a testament to Daniel's wealth. The sound of footsteps behind her broke the silence. She turned to see Daniel stepping onto the terrace, another glass of scotch in hand. His expression was smug, the corners of his mouth curling upward in a self-satisfied smile. "Stealing a moment for yourself, Evelyn?" he asked, his tone light but laced with mockery. "Just ensuring everything is in order, sir," she replied evenly, her gaze unwavering. Daniel took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. You're efficient, I'll give you that. But don't mistake efficiency for importance. People like you, you're here to serve. That's your place. Evelyn's hands clenched at her sides, though her expression remained calm. Of course, sir, she said, her voice steady. Daniel smirked. Good. Just remember that. As he turned to leave, Evelyn watched him go, her jaw tightening imperceptibly. She stayed on the terrace long after he disappeared back inside, the night air cooling the heat of her anger. By the time the party wound down and the last guest departed, the mansion had grown quiet. Daniel retired to his suite, his mind replaying the highlights of the evening. His clever remarks, the laughter of his guests, the admiration in their eyes. It was another successful night, another reminder of his superiority. But Evelyn's mind was elsewhere. In the quiet of her modest quarters, she sat by the small window overlooking the mansion. Her gaze was steady, her thoughts racing. The estate, so grand and imposing, was more than just a symbol of Daniel's success. To her, it was a reminder of everything that had been taken, of a past buried beneath the layers of wealth and power. For now, she kept her plans to herself, her resolve hidden beneath her composed exterior. But deep down, she knew tonight had marked a turning point. The facade of the mansion might remain untouched for now, but the cracks had already begun to form. Imagine being in Evelyn's shoes right now. Would you have stood your ground like she did? Or maybe you see things from Daniel's perspective. Let us know in the comments. And hey, if you're enjoying the story so far, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Let's see how this all unfolds. Morning broke over the Hawthorne estate with the quiet authority of a new day. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Daniel's expansive office, illuminating the rich mahogany furniture and the dark leather of his chair. The air smelled faintly of cedar and leather polish, a testament to the meticulous care put into preserving the room's aura of power and prestige. Daniel sat behind his custom-made oak desk, his green eyes scanning the morning paper while his fingers tapped idly against a steaming cup of coffee. For him, the world had always been simple. There were those who succeeded and those who served. He belonged to the former, and Evelyn, his housekeeper, unequivocally to the latter. The knock at his door came sharply, breaking the silence. Daniel glanced up, irritation flickering across his face. "Enter," he said curtly, his voice clipped and impatient. The door opened, and Evelyn stepped inside. Her uniform was immaculate as always, her dark hair tied back in a neat bun. Her expression was calm, professional, though there was something in her eyes that Daniel couldn't quite place. Defiance? Determination? Whatever it was, it irked him. "You asked to see me, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice steady. "Yes," Daniel replied, motioning for her to approach. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he studied her. "I wanted to discuss last night's performance." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Performance, sir?" Daniel's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Don't play coy, Evelyn. The hors d'oeuvres were late. The timing of service was sloppy, and frankly, your attitude left much to be desired. I don't pay you to embarrass me." Evelyn's posture remained rigid, but her hands tightened subtly at her sides. "I apologize if there were issues, sir. I ensured that everything was handled to the best of my ability." "The best of your ability," Daniel repeated, his tone dripping with mockery. "That's the problem, Evelyn. Your best isn't good enough. This is a house of excellence, not mediocrity." Evelyn took a deep breath, her expression calm but her voice laced with an edge. "If that's how you feel, Mr. Hawthorne, then perhaps it's time we reassess my position here." Daniel blinked, caught off guard by her boldness. For a moment, the room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily between them. "Reassess," he said finally, his voice sharp. "Are you suggesting you want to leave?" "I'm suggesting," Evelyn replied evenly, "that if my work no longer meets your standards, it may be best for both of us if I move on." Daniel leaned forward, his green eyes narrowing. "Do you honestly think you can find a better position elsewhere? You've been here for years. You wouldn't last a day outside these walls." Evelyn didn't flinch. Instead, She met his gaze with quiet determination. "Perhaps," she said simply, "but some things are worth risking comfort for." Her calm demeanor only infuriated Daniel further. He rose from his chair, towering over her as he spoke. "You're forgetting your place, Evelyn. Don't think for a second that you're indispensable." "Of course not, sir," she replied, her tone polite but firm. "I'll gather my things immediately." Daniel opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. He watched as Evelyn turned and left the room, her steps measured and purposeful. For the first time in years, someone had walked away from him without fear or hesitation. The experience was as unsettling as it was infuriating. By mid-morning, the absence of Evelyn's presence was palpable. The household staff moved through their duties with an air of unease, exchanging furtive glances and murmurs. It was as if her departure had left a void that no one dared to acknowledge openly. Daniel, meanwhile, buried himself in his work, attempting to shake the nagging sense of discomfort that lingered after their confrontation. Yet no matter how many emails he sent or phone calls he made, Evelyn's parting words echoed in his mind. "Some things are worth risking comfort for." The distraction reached a breaking point when his assistant, a young man named Julian, entered the office clutching a manila folder. "Mr. Hawthorne," Julian said hesitantly, his voice breaking the quiet. "This just came in. I think you'll want to see it." Daniel gestured impatiently for Julian to hand over the folder. He opened it without a word, his eyes scanning the contents. At first, the words on the page seemed incomprehensible, jumbled together like static. But as the meaning sank in, his grip on the folder tightened, his jaw clenching. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "It's a legal notice, sir," Julian stammered. "It's from Evelyn. She filed a claim on the property this morning." Daniel's eyes snapped to Julian, the color draining from his face. "A claim," he said, his voice rising. "What kind of claim?" Julian swallowed hard, pointing to the document. "She's asserting ownership of the land your mansion is built on, sir. Apparently, she has the deed." For a moment, the office was silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Daniel stared at the paper, his mind racing. The words blurred together: deed, ownership, legal right, each one a dagger to his carefully constructed reality. "That's impossible," he said finally, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Get my lawyer. Now." Julian nodded quickly and left the room, leaving Daniel alone with the document. He set it down on the desk, his hands trembling slightly. How could this be happening? Evelyn, the quiet, obedient housekeeper, now claiming ownership of his most prized possession? It was absurd. And yet, the legal notice in front of him suggested otherwise. Daniel rose from his chair and crossed to the window, staring out at the sprawling estate. The gardens were as immaculate as ever, the fountains glistening in the sunlight. Yet for the first time, the sight didn't fill him with pride. Instead, it filled him with unease. The land, the mansion, the very foundation of his empire. All of it suddenly felt precarious. Evelyn's words came back to him once more, unbidden and unwelcome. "Be careful what you take for granted." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Daniel remained by the window, his mind churning with questions and doubts. Somewhere, Evelyn was out there, and she wasn't just walking away. She was fighting back, and for the first time in his life, Daniel Hawthorne wasn't sure if he could win. The Hawthorne mansion sat like a crown atop its expansive estate, its grandeur undeniable, yet now tainted by a shadow Daniel couldn't ignore. He stood in his study, the legal notice Evelyn had filed spread across his desk, glaring at him like a silent accusation. Outside, the world seemed unchanged. The sun hung high, the manicured gardens sparkled in the light. But inside, Daniel's world was shifting in ways he couldn't yet understand. He paced the length of the room, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. The deed. How could Evelyn, his housekeeper of all people, hold a claim to the land? It was absurd, inconceivable even, but the document was real, and its implications threatened everything he'd built. The sound of the door creaking open pulled him from his thoughts. His lawyer, Charles Briggs, entered, carrying a stack of papers and a weary expression. Charles was a stout man with thinning gray hair and a reputation for untangling even the most convoluted legal messes. Yet, as he approached Daniel's desk, there was a distinct unease in his demeanor. "I reviewed the claim," Charles began, his voice low and deliberate. "It's legitimate." Daniel froze mid-step, turning sharply. "Legitimate?" he echoed, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "How is that possible? That land has been in my family for decades." Charles sighed, setting the papers on the desk. "It has, but only the mansion itself. The land it sits on was part of a separate transaction, one your father arranged years ago. Apparently, there were stipulations tied to it." "Stipulations?" Daniel snapped. "What kind of stipulations?" Charles hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "The land was originally owned by Evelyn's family. Your father acquired it during a time of financial difficulty for them. The terms were legally binding but unconventional. It seems Evelyn's family retained a conditional claim to the property." Daniel's green eyes burned with anger. "And you're just now telling me this?" Charles raised a placating hand. "This isn't in your usual records, Daniel. It's buried in old agreements, ones your father didn't exactly highlight. From what I've gathered, the family's claim would remain dormant unless certain conditions were met." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And Evelyn met those conditions?" "She did," Charles confirmed, flipping through the papers. "From what I can tell, she's been quietly gathering the necessary documentation for years. The claim is airtight." The room fell into a tense silence. Daniel turned back to the window, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as he stared out at the estate. His mind churned with frustration and disbelief. Evelyn, his housekeeper, had orchestrated this. She had moved under his nose for years, preparing to strike, and he had never suspected a thing. "Why?" Daniel muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Charles. "Why now?" Charles hesitated before answering. "She may feel it's her right, Daniel. Her family was forced to give up the land under duress. Perhaps she sees this as reclaiming what was taken." Daniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "So, what? She worked here all these years to spy on me? To gather her little pieces of evidence while cleaning my floors?" "I can't speak to her motives," Charles said cautiously, "but I suggest we address this carefully. A legal battle will be costly, and given the strength of her claim, there's no guarantee of victory." Daniel turned to face him, his expression dark. "I don't care about the cost. This is my land, my mansion. I won't let her take it." Charles nodded slowly. "Understood. I'll begin preparing a response. But I advise you to tread carefully. This could become very public, and if Evelyn decides to air grievances about how she's been treated, it could damage your reputation." After Charles left, Daniel found himself wandering the halls of the mansion. He passed the grand staircase, the gallery of family portraits, the ornate chandeliers, all symbols of his legacy. Yet, as he moved through the space, a nagging feeling grew in the back of his mind. The mansion, once a fortress of his dominance, now felt fragile, like a gilded cage teetering on the edge of collapse. His steps carried him to a room he rarely visited, his father's old study. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the scent of aged paper and dust greeting him. The room was frozen in time. The shelves lined with books his father had favored, the desk still cluttered with artifacts of his business dealings. Daniel's gaze fell on a small wooden box tucked in the corner of the desk. He opened it hesitantly, revealing a stack of letters, their edges yellowed with age. Most were mundane, correspondence about land deals, investments, but one caught his eye. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, the name on it unmistakable, the Brooks family. He pulled the letter out carefully, unfolding it to reveal a single page. The words were terse, the tone formal. It detailed the acquisition of the land the mansion was built on. As Daniel read, a pit formed in his stomach. The terms were clear. The Brooks family had been forced to sell under financial duress, with a clause that allowed for reclamation if certain conditions were met. At the bottom of the page, his father's signature loomed large, bold, and final. Daniel's hands tightened around the paper, his mind racing. His father had always been a shrewd businessman, but this was more than shrewd. It was calculated, predatory. The land hadn't been bought, it had been taken. The weight of the truth settled heavily on Daniel's shoulders. Evelyn's quiet resolve, her years of service, her claim to the land. It all made sense now. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her family, for their legacy, for everything his father had stolen. For the first time, Daniel felt something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger or frustration, but something deeper, an uncomfortable mix of guilt and doubt. The world he had built, the wealth he had amassed, the power he wielded. It had all been built on foundations he hadn't fully understood. And now, those foundations were beginning to crumble. He folded the letter and placed it back in the box, closing the lid with a soft click. As he left the study, the mansion seemed quieter than before, the echoes of his footsteps swallowed by the vast emptiness of the halls. Somewhere, Evelyn was waiting, and Daniel knew that when the time came to face her, he would have to confront not just her claim, but the truth of his family's past and the man he had become. The Hawthorne mansion stood in defiant silence as the morning sun bathed its stone facade in golden light. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but tranquil. Daniel Hawthorne sat in his grand office, the large mahogany desk between him and the rising tension of the situation. Papers were strewn across its surface, but his attention was fixed on one document, the legal claim Evelyn had filed. His fingers drummed against the polished wood as he tried to process the audacity of the move. A sharp knock at the door broke his thoughts. His assistant, Julian, poked his head inside, his expression tense. "Mr. Hawthorne, she's here." Daniel's brows furrowed. "She?" Julian hesitated. "Evelyn, sir. She's asked to speak with you." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Evelyn has asked to speak with me?" he repeated, his voice dripping with incredulity. "The woman who filed a claim on my land now wants an audience? Fine. Send her in." Julian disappeared, and moments later, Evelyn stepped into the room. She moved with a quiet confidence, her posture upright, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Despite the simplicity of her attire, a modest blouse and skirt, there was an undeniable strength in her demeanor. Daniel's eyes flicked over her, searching for some hint of weakness, but found none. "You wanted to see me, Evelyn," Daniel said, gesturing for her to sit. His tone was clipped, dismissive, as though she were a minor inconvenience. Evelyn didn't immediately sit. Instead, she surveyed the room, her gaze lingering on the ornate bookshelves, the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, and finally on Daniel himself. Her expression was calm, unreadable, as if she were weighing the space and the man who occupied it. "I thought it was time we had a conversation," she said finally, her voice measured. She took the chair opposite him, her movements deliberate, her back straight. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "A conversation," he echoed. "After blindsiding me with a legal claim, you think now is the time for a polite chat?" Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "I thought it was time to explain," she replied simply. "You deserve to know why I've taken this step." Daniel's lips curled into a faint smirk, though his eyes remained hard. "You're here to justify stealing from me?" "It's not stealing if it was never truly yours," Evelyn said calmly. Her words hit like a slap, but her tone remained composed. "The land your mansion sits on was taken from my family, Mr. Hawthorne. Not bought, taken." Daniel let out a bitter laugh, leaning back in his chair. "My father acquired this land legally. The deed is in his name. If your family couldn't manage their affairs, that's not my concern. Legally, perhaps," Evelyn conceded, her tone cool. "But you and I both know there's a difference between what is legal and what is right. Your father exploited my family's desperation. He forced a sale under terms that left us with nothing." Daniel's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he had dismissed as insignificant. "You've worked here for years," he said, his voice sharp. "Why now? Why file this claim after all this time?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "I stayed because I needed to. Reclaiming what was lost isn't something you rush. It takes preparation, patience, and resolve. I had to ensure the claim was ironclad before I moved forward. Daniel's hands clenched into fists on the desk. And now you think you've won? You think you can waltz in here and dismantle everything I've built? This isn't about dismantling, Evelyn said, her voice soft but firm. It's about justice. This land was my family's home long before it became your empire. All I want is what was taken from us. Her words hung in the air, filling the room with a quiet tension. For a moment, Daniel was silent, his mind racing. The confident mask he wore was beginning to crack, though he would never admit it. What do you want, Evelyn? He demanded finally. What's your endgame? I want the land returned to my family's name, she replied without hesitation. And I want an acknowledgement of what was done to us. This isn't just about the past, Mr. Hawthorne. It's about the future. Daniel leaned forward, his green eyes narrowing. And if I refuse? If I fight this claim with every resource I have? Evelyn's expression didn't change. Then you'll face the consequences, both legal and moral. You've built your life on power, but power doesn't make you invincible. It doesn't erase responsibility. Her words struck a nerve, though Daniel refused to let it show. He rose from his chair, towering over her. You've overplayed your hand, Evelyn. Don't think for a second that I'll let you take this from me. Evelyn stood as well, her movements calm and deliberate. Despite the difference in their statures, she met his gaze evenly. This isn't a game, Mr. Hawthorne. It's a reckoning. And whether you accept it or not, the truth is on my side. With that, she turned and walked to the door. Daniel watched her go, his fists clenched, his mind churning with anger and disbelief. She paused briefly before leaving, glancing back at him one last time. I'll leave you to think about it, she said, her tone polite but edged with steel. You know where to find me. When the door closed behind her, Daniel sank back into his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. His heart pounded in his chest, though he would never admit it was anything more than anger. Evelyn had shaken him in a way few people ever had. The mansion, so solid and unassailable, now felt fragile, as though the very foundation it was built on had begun to crack. Daniel stared at the legal claim still lying on his desk, the lines of text blurring as his thoughts raced. For the first time in his life, Daniel Hawthorne felt as though the ground beneath his feet was no longer his own. Evelyn sat at the edge of her modest dining table, the morning light streaming through the small window of her cottage. The view outside was unremarkable compared to the sprawling gardens of the Hawthorne estate. Patches of wild grass, a few aging oak trees. But to her, it was a reminder of simpler times, of roots that ran deep in this soil. She folded the legal documents she'd been reviewing, placing them neatly into a worn leather folder. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of years. Years spent piecing together a truth Daniel Hawthorne had long ignored. The quiet knock at her door startled her. She rose, smoothing the front of her blouse, and opened the door to find her old friend and confidant, Margaret Brooks. Margaret was a woman of Evelyn's age, her gray hair tied back loosely, her eyes sharp and filled with the kind of wisdom born of hardship. Well? Margaret asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Did you speak to him? I did, Evelyn replied, closing the door behind her. She gestured for Margaret to sit, then moved to the stove to pour them each a cup of tea. It went about as well as expected. He's furious, of course. Good, Margaret said, her voice firm. He should be. People like Daniel Hawthorne aren't used to being challenged. It's about time someone reminded him he's not untouchable. Evelyn handed Margaret a cup, then sat across from her. It's not just about challenging him, she said quietly. It's about making things right. For my family. For all the families his father trampled over to build that estate. Margaret nodded, her gaze softening. You've done more than anyone else would have, Evelyn. Gathering all this evidence, working under his nose for years. It's remarkable. It wasn't easy, Evelyn admitted, but it was necessary. My parents were forced to sell this land, Margaret. They didn't want to, but they had no choice. And when they left, they carried that pain with them for the rest of their lives. Margaret reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over Evelyn's. You've honored them with what you've done, but are you ready for what comes next? Daniel won't let this go without a fight. Evelyn nodded, her resolve unwavering. I'm ready. He can fight all he wants, but the truth is on my side. Back at the mansion, Daniel paced his study like a caged animal. The more he thought about Evelyn's claim, the angrier he became. The idea that his family's empire could be threatened by a mere housekeeper was inconceivable. Yet, the more he dug into the details of his father's dealings, the harder it became to deny the validity of her claim. He stood before his father's portrait, which hung above the fireplace, a stern, imposing figure in a tailored suit. Daniel had always admired his father's ruthlessness, his ability to seize opportunities others were too timid to pursue. But now, staring into those cold, painted eyes, Daniel felt a flicker of doubt. The sound of footsteps broke his reverie. Charles Briggs, his lawyer, entered the room, carrying a stack of papers. I've been reviewing the records, Charles said, setting the papers on the desk. His expression was grim. And I have to be honest with you, Daniel. This isn't looking good. Daniel turned sharply, his green eyes narrowing. Explain. Charles adjusted his glasses, flipping through the papers. Your father's acquisition of the Brooks land was questionable, to say the least. The family was in financial distress, yes, but the terms of the sale were heavily skewed in his favor. He paid far below market value and included clauses that effectively left them with nothing. That's business, Daniel said coldly. My father was a shrewd negotiator. It's more than that, Charles pressed. The sale included a stipulation, an unusual one. The Brooks family retained a conditional right to reclaim the land if certain criteria were met, including the production of specific documents proving their claim. And Evelyn managed to meet those criteria? Daniel asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. She did, Charles confirmed. She's been working on this for years, Daniel. She's gathered every piece of evidence, every record, every witness she could find. Her case is solid. Daniel let out a harsh laugh, running a hand through his dark hair. So, what are you saying, Charles? That I should roll over and let her take my land? I'm saying, Charles replied carefully, that you need to think strategically. A legal battle will be costly, and given the strength of her case, there's a real chance you could lose. Daniel stared at his lawyer, his mind racing. For years, he had believed himself untouchable, his wealth and power shielding him from consequences. But now, faced with Evelyn's quiet determination and the truth of his father's actions, he felt the ground shifting beneath him. I'll fight, he said finally, his voice low but resolute. I don't care how long it takes or how much it costs. That land is mine, and I won't let her take it. Charles sighed but nodded, gathering his papers. I'll prepare for the worst then. But Daniel, you need to be careful. Evelyn isn't just fighting for land. She's fighting for justice. And that's a powerful motivator. Evelyn spent the rest of the day preparing for the battle ahead. She went through her files meticulously, ensuring every piece of evidence was accounted for. Her family's old photographs, letters, and legal documents were all carefully organized, each one a testament to the history Daniel's father had tried to erase. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in hues of orange and gold, Evelyn stepped outside. She stood at the edge of the field where her family's farmhouse had once stood. The air was quiet, the only sound the rustle of the wind through the grass. She closed her eyes, memories flooding back. Her father's laughter, her mother's voice calling her in for dinner, the warmth of a home that had been stolen from them. This land wasn't just property. It was a piece of her soul, a connection to the past that refused to be severed. I'll make this right, she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. No matter what it takes. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Evelyn turned and walked back to her cottage, her resolve stronger than ever. The battle for the land was only just beginning, but she was ready. For her family, for their legacy, and for the justice they deserved. The air in the Hawthorne mansion was heavy with unspoken tension as evening settled over the estate. Shadows stretched long across the grand hallways, their darkness echoing the mood within. Daniel Hawthorne sat in his office, the ornate desk a fortress between him and the storm brewing outside its walls. In front of him lay two piles, one filled with carefully organized legal documents Evelyn had filed, the other, his own hastily assembled defense. He leaned back in his leather chair, his green eyes fixed on the door as though willing it to remain closed. The knock came just as he reached for his glass of scotch. Sharp and deliberate, it cut through the stillness like a blade. Daniel set the glass down, irritation flickering across his face. "Come in," he said, his voice firm. The door opened to reveal Evelyn. She stepped into the room with the same quiet confidence she had displayed in their previous encounters. Tonight, though, there was a palpable energy about her, a sense of finality that made Daniel sit a little straighter. "Mr. Hawthorne," she greeted, her tone measured. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Daniel replied, gesturing toward the chair opposite him. "I had a feeling you'd be back." Evelyn took the seat, her movements deliberate. She placed a folder on the desk, its edges worn from years of handling. Daniel's eyes flicked to it, curiosity tugging at his frustration. "Let me guess," he said, leaning forward. "More evidence? Another twist in your campaign to dismantle my life?" Evelyn met his gaze evenly. "Not a twist, Mr. Hawthorne. The truth. Something I think you've spent far too long avoiding." Daniel's smirk faltered, and for a moment, the room was silent save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Evelyn opened the folder, revealing a collection of faded photographs, handwritten letters, and yellowed legal documents. She slid one across the desk toward him. "This," she began, her voice steady, "is a letter your father wrote to mine. It's dated 2 months before the sale of the land. In it, he acknowledges my family's struggles and offers what he called a lifeline. What he didn't mention was the predatory nature of the terms he imposed." Daniel picked up the letter, his eyes scanning the neat, formal handwriting. His father's voice seemed to echo in the words, sharp and businesslike, with just enough feigned empathy to mask the ruthlessness beneath. He set it down, his jaw tightening. "You think this changes anything?" he asked. "Whatever happened back then, it was legal. My father was a businessman, not a charity. He was a predator," Evelyn countered, her voice rising slightly. "He saw an opportunity to exploit my family's desperation, and he took it. He left us with nothing, Mr. Hawthorne, not even a home." Daniel leaned back, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. "And what do you want me to do about it? Undo history? Rewrite the past?" "I want you to take responsibility," Evelyn replied, her tone firm. "I want you to acknowledge what was done to my family, to stop hiding behind your father's legacy and face the truth." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "You're asking me to dismantle everything I've built, Evelyn. Do you have any idea what that means? What this mansion, this estate, represents?" "I do," she said quietly. "It represents your power, your wealth, your privilege. But to me, it represents something else. It's a reminder of everything we lost, of the lives that were broken so this could exist." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of generations. Daniel stared at her, his mind racing. For so long, he had believed in his own invincibility, his right to everything he owned. But now, faced with the evidence of his father's actions and Evelyn's quiet determination, cracks were beginning to form in his certainty. "You're not going to back down, are you?" he said finally, his voice low. "No," Evelyn replied simply. "This land is my family's legacy, Mr. Hawthorne. I won't let it be buried any longer." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And what if I fight you? What if I take this to court and use every resource I have to crush your claim?" "Then you'll be fighting against the truth," Evelyn said. "And the truth has a way of winning, no matter how much money or power you throw at it." The room fell silent once more, the tension between them thick and unyielding. Daniel stared at the folder on the desk, its contents a stark reminder of the man his father had been, and the man he had become. "You've given me a lot to think about," he said finally, his voice measured. "But don't mistake my hesitation for weakness. This isn't over." Evelyn rose from her chair, her posture as composed as ever. "I never expected it to be easy, Mr. Hawthorne, but I'm not afraid of you, or your wealth, or your power. I'm fighting for something far greater than all of that, She turned and walked toward the door, pausing just before she left. "I'll give you some time to decide how you want to proceed. But remember, the longer you wait, the harder it will be to make things right." As the door closed behind her, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his mind a whirlwind of anger, frustration, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. For the first time, he felt the weight of his father's legacy bearing down on him, not as a source of pride, but as a burden. The mansion, once a fortress of his power, now felt like a gilded cage. And in the quiet of his office, Daniel began to wonder if Evelyn wasn't just fighting for justice, but for something he had lost without even realizing it: his own humanity. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Hawthorne mansion, its gilded windows shimmering against the deepening orange sky. Daniel Hawthorne sat alone in his study, the room steeped in a heavy, oppressive silence. The documents Evelyn had left behind lay spread across his desk, their yellowed edges a reminder of a history he had never questioned. He leaned back in his chair, his green eyes fixed on the ceiling as memories of his father began to surface unbidden. Edward Hawthorne had always been larger than life in Daniel's eyes. A man of sharp wit and unyielding ambition, he had built the Hawthorne empire through what he often called strategic decisions. As a child, Daniel had idolized him, soaking in his father's stories of shrewd deals and calculated risks. But now, staring at the evidence of Edward's predatory acquisition of the Brooks land, Daniel found himself questioning everything he had been taught to believe. He picked up the faded letter Evelyn had shown him earlier, his father's signature bold and unapologetic at the bottom. The words were clinical, devoid of empathy, offering Evelyn's family a pittance for land that had likely been their lifeblood for generations. Daniel's hand tightened around the page, the paper crinkling slightly under the pressure. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes lingering on the letter before finally muttering, "Come in." The door creaked open, and Julian, his assistant, stepped inside cautiously. "Mr. Hawthorne, I wasn't sure if you wanted to be disturbed, but you've missed several calls." Daniel waved a dismissive hand. "I don't care about the calls right now, Julian. Is there something important?" Julian hesitated, then placed a folder on the desk. "It's more information from Charles. He thought you might want to see it." Daniel eyed the folder warily, as though it might contain another revelation he wasn't prepared to face. "Leave it," he said curtly. "I'll look at it later." Julian nodded and retreated, leaving Daniel alone once more. The folder sat untouched for several moments before Daniel finally reached for it, unable to resist the pull of its contents. Inside were detailed accounts of his father's dealings, contracts, witness statements, and even personal letters from families whose land Edward had acquired under similarly questionable circumstances. One letter stood out, written by Evelyn's father. The handwriting was shaky but clear, the words filled with quiet desperation. He had written to Edward after the sale, pleading for more time to relocate his family and salvage what little they had left. Edward's response had been clipped and cold, offering no assistance and closing with a stark reminder that any further delays would result in legal action. Daniel set the letter down, his chest tightening. This wasn't just a case of shrewd business. It was exploitation, plain and simple. His father had built his empire on the backs of families like Evelyn's, and now Daniel was left to grapple with the weight of that legacy. The mansion's grandeur seemed to mock him as he wandered its halls, the ornate chandeliers and polished marble floors a stark contrast to the turmoil inside him. Every detail of the estate, from its sprawling gardens to its towering columns, had been a source of pride. Now, it felt hollow, its beauty tainted by the truth of its origins. Daniel found himself in the gallery, a room lined with portraits of his ancestors. His father's portrait dominated the space, its imposing presence a constant reminder of the man who had shaped Daniel's life. He stood before it, his hands in his pockets, his gaze locked on Edward's piercing eyes. "You always said the ends justified the means," Daniel muttered aloud, his voice low. "That success was all that mattered. But you never had to deal with the fallout, did you?" He turned away, his footsteps echoing as he moved toward the far end of the gallery. There, tucked away in a corner, was a small portrait he had never paid much attention to before. It depicted the original Brooks farmhouse, a modest structure surrounded by fields of wheat and corn. The contrast between the humble painting and the opulence of the mansion was stark, a visual reminder of the land's transformation under the Hawthorne name. Daniel stared at the painting for a long moment, his thoughts swirling. The farmhouse was gone now, replaced by the sprawling estate he called home. But for Evelyn and her family, it had been more than just a building. It had been their livelihood, their history, their home, and his father had taken it from them without a second thought. Later that evening, Daniel retreated to the terrace, a glass of scotch in hand. The cool night air did little to ease the weight on his shoulders. He gazed out over the estate, the gardens glowing softly under the moonlight. It was a view he had admired countless times before, but tonight it felt different. Instead of pride, he felt a gnawing sense of guilt. The sound of footsteps broke his solitude. He turned to see Charles approaching, his expression as grim as ever. "I thought I might find you here," Charles said, stopping a few feet away. "I've been reviewing the latest documents, and I think it's time we had a serious conversation." Daniel gestured for him to sit, but Charles shook his head. "This isn't about strategy, Daniel. It's about choices. You can keep fighting Evelyn, drag this out in court, and probably lose. Or you can face the truth and try to make things right." Daniel took a long sip of his scotch, the amber liquid burning as it went down. "And what does making things right look like, Charles? Handing over the land? Apologizing for something I didn't do?" "It's not about what you did or didn't do," Charles replied. "It's about what you represent. Your family took something from Evelyn's. You have a chance to change that, to prove that you're not just your father's son." Daniel stared at the glass in his hand, the liquid catching the moonlight. For years, he had defined himself by his success, his ability to maintain the legacy his father had built. But now, that legacy felt like a chain around his neck, dragging him down. "I need time to think," he said finally, his voice quiet. Charles nodded. "Take the time you need, but don't wait too long. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt." As Charles walked away, Daniel remained on the terrace, the weight of his decisions pressing heavily on him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what the right choice was, or if he had the courage to make it. The estate stretched out before him, vast and unyielding, but Daniel felt smaller than ever. The night deepened, and with it came the realization that the man he had been might not be the man he needed to become. The first light of dawn crept over the Hawthorne estate, painting the sprawling gardens in soft hues of gold and pink. The mansion, with its towering columns and intricate stonework, seemed almost serene, untouched by the storm of conflict that had consumed its walls. Inside, however, Daniel Hawthorne sat in his study, his once pristine desk cluttered with papers and memories he could no longer ignore. He hadn't slept. The weight of Evelyn's claim, and the undeniable truth behind it, pressed heavily on his chest. He stared at the letter from Evelyn's father, its fragile paper worn from years of handling. His father's cold, calculated response was burned into his mind, a stark reminder of the man who had shaped him. Daniel leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. For years, he had believed that success justified everything, that his family's empire was a monument to hard work and ambition. But now, he saw it for what it truly was, a legacy built on the backs of others, on land stolen from families like Evelyn's. A knock at the door broke the stillness. "Come in," Daniel called, his voice hoarse. The door opened, and Charles Briggs stepped inside, his expression as solemn as ever. "Good morning," he said, setting his briefcase on the desk. "I take it you've been thinking." Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "Thinking, drinking, regretting. Take your pick." Charles didn't smile. "Evelyn's claim is solid, Daniel. If this goes to court, you'll lose. But this isn't just about the land, is it?" Daniel shook his head, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "No," he admitted. "It's about everything. My father, this estate, the way I've lived my life. For years, I've ignored the consequences of our success. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that it was just business. But now," he trailed off, his gaze dropping to the letter. Charles studied him for a moment before speaking. You have a chance to make this right. Not just legally, but morally. But you need to decide what kind of man you want to be. Daniel nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. I know. Later that morning, Evelyn stood outside her cottage, the crisp autumn air biting at her cheeks. She had spent the early hours preparing her files, bracing herself for what she knew would be a long and grueling battle. Yet, as she gazed toward the distant silhouette of the mansion, a part of her hoped it wouldn't come to that. The sound of tires crunching against gravel drew her attention. A sleek black car approached, its polished exterior gleaming in the sunlight. Evelyn's heart quickened as the vehicle came to a stop, and Daniel Hawthorne stepped out. He was dressed simply, dark slacks and a white shirt, his jacket slung over one arm. His usual air of confidence was tempered, his expression unreadable as he approached. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Evelyn, Daniel began, his voice softer than she expected. Thank you for seeing me. She nodded, her gaze steady. What brings you here, Mr. Hawthorne? Daniel hesitated, his green eyes meeting hers. I wanted to talk, not as adversaries, but as two people tied to the same piece of land. Evelyn studied him carefully, searching for any hint of condescension or manipulation. Finding none, she gestured toward the small table on her porch. All right, she said. Let's talk. They sat across from each other, the tension between them palpable. Daniel placed a folder on the table, its edges frayed from handling. This, he said, sliding it toward her, is everything. The deeds, the contracts, the letters. I've spent the past few days going through it all. Evelyn opened the folder, her eyes scanning its contents. It was thorough, more so than she expected. She looked up at Daniel, her brow furrowed. Why are you showing me this? Because you deserve to see it, he said simply. My father took your family's land, and he did it in a way that was legal but not just. I can't change what he did, but I can try to make it right. Evelyn's breath caught, her heart pounding. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm giving the land back, Daniel replied, his voice steady. Not as a settlement, not as a compromise. It's yours, Evelyn. It always should have been. For a moment, Evelyn couldn't speak. She stared at him, her mind racing to process his words. Why now? She asked finally. What changed? Daniel sighed, his gaze dropping to the table. You did. You reminded me that this land isn't just property. It's history, legacy, family. I've spent my whole life chasing power, thinking it would make me untouchable. But you've shown me that real strength comes from owning your mistakes and doing better. Evelyn's eyes softened, though her voice remained firm. And what about you, Mr. Hawthorne? What happens to your mansion, your empire? Daniel let out a small, rueful laugh. I'll figure it out. Maybe it's time I stopped hiding behind my father's shadow and built something of my own. Something I can be proud of. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, then extended her hand. Thank you, she said quietly. Daniel shook her hand, his grip firm but warm. Thank you, Evelyn, for forcing me to see what I couldn't. As they stood, the morning sun bathed the land in a golden glow. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt a sense of peace, a connection to the past that no longer felt burdened by loss. And for Daniel, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one built on integrity rather than ambition. Together, they looked out over the land, the weight of history between them but no longer dividing them. The Hawthorne estate, once a symbol of greed and exploitation, now held the promise of redemption and renewal.